Thanks so much, Tony, and happy to be back. A few hours later, I'm on the West Coast, so that first session was 6 in the morning for me, so it's not quite so early now, but that's fine. I'm Richard Campbell. You can reach me on Twitter. This is a separate tale, although very much adjacent to .NET, about Microsoft getting involved in open source. And for a lot of folks who are kind of newer into this space, it's easy to fall into the idea that at Build, when especially Build 2014, when Satya becomes the CEO and they ship Roslyn, the C# compiler written in C# as cross-platform open source, like that was the magical open source day. But it's not true. It started a long time before that. And it has to do a lot with how software is made as a whole. So if we jump all the way back to the early days of Microsoft, to the disco days of Microsoft, of that original logo and the aesthetic around that. This is Bill and Paul starting out the company. Bill's dropped out of Harvard and joined Paul in New Mexico, and Bill's a genius. Like it's obvious today, but you got to understand how important what he was thinking about back then was. At that time, software was almost entirely free. Microcomputers were hobbyist machines, and the software came with the computer. Nobody sold software, really. When you bought the computer, it came with the machine, and everybody kind of coded their own things. And the side effect of that was that every time a new piece of hardware came out, and it happened very often in those early days, you were pretty much starting from scratch over and over and over again. And so Bill's insight was that we should be selling the software, and the software should be agnostic to the platform. And he started with development tools. He was making versions of BASIC based on the Dartmouth BASIC that ran across a bunch of different machines. But he wanted to sell the software. And at the time, everyone would share software. And so very early on, going back into in 1977, he wrote a letter to the Homebrew Computer Club, where he talked about the fact that if you keep giving out software for free like this, we're never going to be able to build our industry. That this is sort of key to making to growing up the industry as a whole, is that software should be able to be a business. And he largely succeeded. The funny part is, I think in history we may actually discover that really what Bill ends up being known for is the EULA, the End User License Agreement. And that's actually pretty important, especially in those early days, because if you really read a EULA, and it's hard to do because it'll knock you out, and they're huge and long. They're great big pieces of legalese, but they do a couple of important things. I mean, one of the things they say is that you don't actually own your software, that you, but for the money you have paid, are only paying for a license to use it. And there's an important reason for that. That reason really comes down to liability protection. In common consumer law, we sell you a product, it comes with a sort of fit for purpose rule. And so if it causes problems, you have legal liability as the provider of that product. And so what the EULA does is says the liability limits of this license is the amount you paid for it. So if you use an Excel spreadsheet to design a bridge, and the Excel spreadsheet has a bug in it that causes you to design the bridge wrong so that it collapses, Microsoft will give you back the money for your Excel spreadsheet, not for the price of the bridge damage. I mean, that's really what EULAs are ultimately about. And in the early days of computing, that was very incentivizing, that it would protect us from rapid innovation potentially causing problems. We can argue whether the EULA is still appropriate today. It still makes sense today that our industry is starting to evolve and we're becoming more of an engineering discipline, and liability is an important part of being in a discipline. But the making of the business of software, of that licensing model, led to this entire construct. There's more to it than that. It's not just closed source software and open source software, but there was also this belief that if software is the asset, then it does need to be protected. And that led to software patents. And to this day inside of Microsoft, although less so than there was in the past, but certainly through the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, a core part of your job, if you work for a company like Microsoft and any other of these tech giants, is as you were writing this software, as pieces got finished, you would sit down with patent lawyers and you'd file patents. And in fact, part of your compensation as an employee was to file a certain number of patents. And you'd get these little cubes. They come in different forms these days that were sort of congratulations on creating a patent. And of course, licensing to Microsoft, since Microsoft paid you to develop that. So ultimately they own that. And this sort of grew to a head, this building up of the patent portfolios through the 80s and the 90s. This is where all of the patent trolling came from. And there was, you think about back in the 80s, 90s, all these lawsuits between these different tech corporations that they would use their patent arsenals to fight each other. And it eventually became kind of a mutually assured destruction model. If you sue me over some patents, I can sue you back for some other patents. You know, so all these patents are relatively vague, and it just became a great big cash sink for lawyers. And ultimately, the model has evolved to the point where today there's kind of a truce. There's a lot of cross-licensing going on. So if you're part of the insider club between all of these different tech giants and you're in all that licensing deal, you really won't sue each other. I would argue, though, that it creates a great barrier to entry for any other up-and-coming tech company, that if you're not part of this great big licensing block, you are vulnerable. So it's certainly far from fixed, and we can spend a lot of time on patents, but I wanted to help you understand is that this bringing of open source to Microsoft is not just, hey, let's open source, but rather a very fundamental change in the way they write software, because you can't patent that which you're going to expose. Open source, it makes no sense. You invalidate the patent. Why spend the money or rate the effort? In fact, patents are kind of working the other way now, that we're often protecting software from people exploiting it as well. All right, I'm going to do a little bit of the adjacent story that I did also with the history of .NET, but I'll go quickly over it. So I hope you're all there this morning when I did that first talk. And I was talking again about one of those pivotal moments at Microsoft, which was this Getty picture of Bill and Steve so happy together. This is right before the descent into the battle of the Department of Justice, where Bill is considered a master of the universe. He's succeeded in putting PCs on everybody's business desktop, at least, and becomes this gigantic guy. What's really interesting, if you go back and study that time, is in that period in the 90s, there was this bubble around Microsoft where Bill could kind of do no wrong, at least from the Microsoft employee perspective. But there were other folks that were more questioning. But he also had this huge impact on industry. Anytime he ever spoke about an industry, the stock prices of that industry would go down. I mean, today, you see that in Jeff Bezos. If Jeff talks about any industry that Amazon might be interested in, every other company in that industry takes a hit. And that was very much the way it was for Bill in the 90s, especially. And then, we have that great deposition from the Senate where Bill is stunningly rude, foolishly rude. You can go watch these YouTube videos and just think about how he's acting towards the Senate. And there's plenty to be concerned about with politicians, especially ones that are not particularly technical. But it did not help the case of Microsoft being that arrogant that it ultimately did lead to the Department of Justice and the so-called busting of Bill. And I've used those Tube Time magazine covers just to show how quickly, in a period of 5 years, from 1995 to 1999, we changed this story arc. It's very much an Americanism too. I mean, I know mostly talking to a U.S. crowd today, but that you build up the little guy till he becomes the giant rock star, and then you tear him back down again. And admittedly, Microsoft had some issues in the ways they did some things, and that ultimately led to Bill stepping down as CEO, Steve taking over. This is actually a picture from that announcement. It is something that was already in process. Steve had been gradually taking on more and more duties from Bill anyway, but definitely the Department of Justice and the declaration of Microsoft as pernicious monopoly accelerated that. And Steve's first job as CEO was to fight the splitting of Microsoft, because they had been ordered to split. And he succeeded. It took him about 2 years to get the consent decree in November of 2001 to keep the company together. And part of that was to be a more open company. The complaints that had been made towards Microsoft around those behaviors is that there was a belief that they were writing software that made competing products fail on their operating systems. Real Networks had a real player that they always complained did not play as well as Media Player, and that Microsoft was doing something heinous there. It turned out not to be true, But part of that consent decree included opening up the source code of Windows to companies who needed it. So you sort of had to make a case-by-case basis. And in the case of real players, for example, they really did get access to the source code to see how to interact with Windows more efficiently to make a better player. There are plenty of other examples that look like that. And then in that same time period is when .NET was first announced. This was at the PDC in 2000. And they used the term, they described .NET as a new platform based on internet standards. Now, that's an interesting statement. It's not really what .NET was about. But remember, this is in the midst of negotiating the consent decree. It's also at a time when Microsoft's working very hard to be a meaningful player in the internet space. I mean, it's, again, silly to think about today, 20 years on, but back then, Microsoft was behind the ball on internet. Their early technologies had problems. You know, it was hard. There were better ways to work on the net than with Microsoft technologies. And so we know with .NET, they created ASP.NET Web Forms and made it a little easier for folks that were coming from the existing Windows environment to work more in the internet. But the announcement at the PDC also included publishing specifications for C# and the common language infrastructure. And now, again, gestures towards being a more open organization. And we know that a very young Miguel Diaz, and I love this picture of him because he's like 29 in this. In July of 2001, he announced that he was going to take those specifications and a clean room implementation of .NET for Linux that we now know as Mono. And when .NET shipped in 2002, they also released this shared source common language infrastructure. The code name was Rotor, which is a lot more digestible than SSCLI. Just to think you think that just WCF and WPF were bad names at Microsoft. They've been making them for a long, long time. Now, Rotor was this concept of shared source. So it was .NET, but none of the Windows stuff in it. So it had the runtime, base class libraries, a C# compiler, and it was an academic research license. So you had to provide academic credentials to Microsoft, and they would give you a license to look at the code. You couldn't compile it, right? It wasn't complete. There's no build systems and so forth. But also, it's 2002. Like, all of that is pretty rough. And the way they built .NET back then was on internal infrastructure that was kind of unique. So, but if you were interested in how they coded things, like, that's what this is for. It never really evolved. It was around for a couple of years. But, and again, a lot of this, to me, appears these were the gestures they made to convince the Department of Justice to not force the company to break up, that it was part of the consent decree to open up that source code and to provide access to things. So it happened early on. And this is not open source, right? This may be shared source, but it's hardly open source. So fast forward a bit, maybe 2005 or so, talk about ASP.NET Web Forms. So Web Forms was invented by our friend Scott Guthrie, along with Mark Anderson, a bunch of other great people, as a set of tooling specifically to help WinForm developers, folks coming from the VB community and elsewhere, to work in .NET to be able to get on using internet technologies. It concealed a lot of the way that the internet worked, a way that HTTP exchanges worked, for better or worse. It got folks started. But when you hide the plumbing like that, people abuse the plumbing. And so by 2005, by version 2 of Visual Studio and .NET, it's mature, but people are making big enough things with it now that they're starting to have problems with size and scale. And there are more fun ways to write software for the web than the .NET Web Forms. And the best example of this, I think, would be Ruby on Rails. So David Heinemeier Hansen is a DHH, is what people refer to him, a remarkable guy. Makes a product called Basecamp to this day, and is really one of the Girardi of the internet. When you talk about the death of IE6, DHH was directly involved with that. He was one of the first to say, hey, Basecamp isn't going to deal with IE6 anymore. But before all of that, he had, in the early aughts, been tinkering with the idea of creating a rapid development system, a RAD approach to web development. And he took an old language off the shelf, Ruby, which is a dynamic language, and he combined it with a scaffolding system he called Rails, and made it really rapid fire development for the web, that you could point at data and lay out some rules, and boom, have some pages generated. And when you weren't happy with those, tweak a few of the rules, do it again. Delightful way to write software. Scalable, separate problem. Reliable, testable, there's all challenges there, but fun, fast. One of my best metrics of how successful was Ruby on Rails, Apple included it with the Mac OS in 2007. Apple, who fundamentally don't like developers, like that product enough that they included it with the Mac OS. So this was something that guys like Guthrie paid a lot of attention to, that they knew their corporate development approach, that web forms approach, wasn't appealing to the broader web audience. The web audience liked Rails. And so at the Mix event in 2006, the beginning of the Mix shows, I did several of them, this was really Microsoft trying to reach into the web community and understand it better, be affected by it as well as affected. So at the Mix event is where they made a whole array of announcements that were, let's call them open source-ish. They were trying, without a doubt. Now, I mean, a few big things that came out of Mix. They got back to making Internet Explorer again. IE6 had shipped back in 2001 as part of XP, and here we are in 2006, and they say, hey, we're finally going to make an IE7. IE6 is not inherently evil. Yes, there was a different Microsoft back then in 2000. They had rapidly iterated on IE as the specifications had iterated. When they shipped IE6 in October of 2001, it was before CSS has been ratified as CSS 1. And so there was some substantial changes that happened between the time that they shipped IE6 with the pre-release CSS and CSS 1. So IE6 was never compliant with CSS. And the only reason that IE6 became such a big deal is that then Microsoft stopped looking at making browsers for several years. So XP being a very successful operating system and IE6 being the default browser for it meant that it became this kind of plague, that it was not popular because it was part of XP and not compliant with standards. We still have browsers like that. Look at Safari, default browser for the iPad, not compliant with standards, but popular. And so, that's how IE6 got into that situation. So Mix is where they announced IE7, but they also talked about a whole host of other things. This is where they introduced Codeplex. So they decided they were going to make their own SourceForge. This is the time of SourceForge and the like, before GitHub. And Codeplex was going to be this open source community, and it was where they were going to put different libraries, starting with a very popular library that they were already building called Ajax. So, this funny story around all of this, that early on in the history of the Exchange server, the Exchange team went to we're talking to the browser team. They said, listen, we want to have a web version of Outlook, right? OWA, or Outlook Web Access. And we really want a way to tell people when mail arrives, the ping. It's like, could you cobble in this little XML HTTP notifier for us? Just sneak it in there. And the IE6 team did. And fundamentally, that's kind of the beginning of Ajax. That this ability to make calls into web pages and render only pieces of it. And the toolkit was trying to package that capability up for more folks to use. And it was one of the first things they put on a Codeplex that people really liked. Now, was it open source? The source was available, kind of came with, but they weren't building. The way we think about open source today, where folks are actually coding out in the open and taking contributions from others and exceptions, none of that was happening. At Codeplex, they would publish the code. And you could write comments back, and that process would go into the back rooms where they would discuss the comments and maybe make some changes and then push those changes back out again. So it was the beginning of that. But I think it was MVC where they really tried to get into a cycle that looked more like what we would consider modern open source development. That they had some ideas for MVC early on, and they worked on it privately. Actually, there was the primary source code repository was still internal, but they would make regular publications into Codeplex. People would take it out for a spin. They would have their comments. They would push things back, and these folks iterated relatively quickly. So you started to see that feedback loop that delights folks, where you can have a conversation about a problem you're having with a tool, and within a week or two, you would see results kind of showing up in these interim builds, these community previews. So the MVC group really sort of moved that piece along a fair bit. Another thing that came out of that Mix 06 was talking about Silverlight for the first time. It was WPFE, or Windows Presentation Foundation Everywhere. But it was an idea that they could create a runtime, and we didn't, they didn't talk about it being an alternative to Flash, but one of the ways to look at the name Silverlight, there is an object called Silverlight that's not this library. When you think of the old flash bulbs, those little cubes, they have an array of magnesium filaments inside them, and you jolt a bit of electricity through it from your camera, and it burns it and makes that bright flash. There's debris left behind inside that container, and the name of that debris is Silverlight. So Silverlight is what you get after Flash. So Silverlight continued to rewrite. The original version was primarily media, actually coded with JavaScript. It wasn't until version 2 in 2008 that we actually got .NET involved, with .NET 3 and C# in the beginning of an implementation of the model view model patterns, and it took off. People liked it a lot. It was very exciting as an approach to development. It'll have problems in 2010, but right now we're in the shiny days, so let's skip past that. I want to talk a little bit about the larger open source movement that happened at that time. There were groups of folks who were that were deeply immersed in the open source community and worked in the Microsoft ecosystem. There were a lot of folks in the Microsoft ecosystem that had no exposure to open source at all and weren't interested. In a lot of ways, the early days of Microsoft, they modeled themselves after IBM. That sort of mantra, nobody ever got fired for buying IBM. They wanted to be that company, the big blue. And so they sort of created complete solutions, at least it presented was complete solutions, and supported that culture of developer that, as long as you use the Microsoft tools, you'll be good. And maybe there were a few third-party companies that were Microsoft partners, right? The Telerix and the DevExpresses and the Syncfusions and the Infogestics, all of those folks that made tooling as well. But the broader open source community, that was not something that a lot of folks looked at. The alt.NET movement is an interesting one to me. I encountered it right at the beginning before it was called that. I was making .NET Rocks, and I believe it was an MVP summit, I went looking. I wanted to do an interview about Entity Framework before Entity Framework had shipped. So I was aware that the thing existed. Link for SQL was already out there. And I went looking for the folks that were involved in Entity Framework. And I walked into a room where they were talking about the first implementation of Entity Framework. And inside that room were a group of very excited people. And these folks mostly used an open source ORM called Hibernate. And they were not pleased that Microsoft was building something new as an ORM rather than supporting Hibernate as an open source project, and that they were going to make all the same mistakes. It was, let's call it a vigorous conversation. And I may have commented on .NET Rocks that they were the Hibernate Mafia. And certain Jeremy Miller wrote a blog post where he said, if we don't come up with a better name than Campbell's Hibernate Mafia, that's what we're going to be for the rest of our lives. So they called themselves alt.NET, which, admittedly, is a better name. Now, we could talk a lot about the importance of alt.NET one way or the other. In fact, I had Jerry Miller back on the show not that long ago where I said, hey, that original mission of alt.NET to get more .NET developers using open source, I think you succeeded. Because without a doubt, Microsoft itself has come to open source, and much of its community uses open source libraries. In some cases, whether they understand they are or not. So we can argue methods one way or the other, but there's an apocryphal story. And that story is actually wrapped around the original version of ASP.NET MVC. So early on, before MVC was widely known, there was prototypes flowing inside of Microsoft. And Scott wanted to bring more open source people into the organization. And so he actually used those prototypes to recruit Scott Hanselman, Phil Hack, Rob Connery. In fact, Phil Hack's blog post about seeing MVC early on, just as he was getting hired, is still out there somewhere if you want to read about it. And they had gotten an invitation by the alt.net folks at the first alt.net conference, which is being held in Austin, Texas. This is 2007. And so the apocryphal story is that Scott Guthrie prototyped MVC on the way to the Austin conference and showed it off. That's not actually what happened. It already existed. It had been worked on for some time, but he showed it to them. He hadn't intended anyone to see it yet, but he wrote a demo app on the flight down. And for his keynote, knowing of the complaints of ASP.NET Web Forms with its lack of testability and pluggability and difficulty in making manageable code around, he showed how MVC addressed a number of those issues. And Phil and Scott and Rob were all with them, and they had an interesting conversation, no two ways about that. And so that iteration of coding MVC internally, pushing versions up to Codeplex, external folks get to interact with it, play with it, use it in things, push back their comments, and then those get rolled into the next dev cycle. And it took a while. And by the way, if you recognize this picture, it's from the ASP.NET MVC book. It's the only, it's a composed picture, by the way. The four of them never stood in the same place. And that photograph of Scott Guthrie is from his first photo as a Microsoft employee in 1997. And this is from a book in 2008. So he was very, very young. All right, moving along. So by .NET 3.5, so this is 2008 now that we're up to 3.5, they update that shared source model, Rotor, into what they now call the Microsoft reference source. Open source? Not really, but it's a little bit more. You can now use these reference source code libraries to actually debug into .NET. So if you're building something that's causing errors inside of .NET, you can actually walk through that code now. So you start to see the ability to access more code. Now, this mostly worked on server-side stuff. So it was really sort of recognizing the web team was opening up more and more, and so they pushed for the reference source license rather than the client-side team, which was still very much more traditional enterprise closed source development. So also in 2008, first version of GitHub goes live. That's the original logo. The Octocat would come later. But it is a part of the evolution of the open source community was a new environment. And GitHub had a very key idea, this sort of introduction of the social aspect of software, of good conversational tools around your source code as well, that you can speak in code with pull requests and contributions, as well as actually writing, as well as just a forum. John Resig first put together jQuery back in 2006, recognizing the need to be able to walk across the DOM to deal with unidentified elements, like on and on and on. jQuery grew. This problem of DOM tree traversal existed inside of MVC as well. MVC was headed down the path of realizing, hey, we've got all of these problems. We need a library. It should be its own thing. And pretty quickly inside of the team, the web savvy folks are like, hey, jQuery does this. We shouldn't write our own. A prototype got built, but as it started to surface onto Codeplex, the community also jumped on and pushed and said, dude, don't write this. jQuery is the way to do this. It's the right thing. And they won. That argument ultimately succeeded to the point where inside of Studio 2010, jQuery shipped. Right, it was an important part of MVC working well, and MVC 2 was part of Studio 2010 and Mix in 2010 when they, and then in the Studio 2010 show in April, is when they put out this great version of Studio, one of the definitive versions where they'd redone the UI in WPF, but they also included jQuery with its original license too. There was a lot of pressure around how to license jQuery internally. But Microsoft made substantial contributions to jQuery, which actually drove jQuery into this model, becoming the jQuery Foundation, which is now the JavaScript Foundation. So important steps there. I mean, I would say that's a milestone. When Microsoft is now incorporating an open source library as part of their product and is providing tech support to it and providing contributions to it. They're still not making open source, although they had to some degree. They were going down the path with Codeplex. And there were other open source libraries here and there elsewhere in the organization. But on the dev side, jQuery in the box was kind of a big deal. And it upset some folks too. You know, if you were used to living in that I just get all my stuff from Microsoft world, the idea that jQuery was in the box was kind of freaky for everyone. At that same time, or shortly thereafter, the issues around package management sort of raised to the top, and Phil Hack took the lead under direction from Scott Guthrie to make a package manager for the .NET community. There were other products out there, or starting to emerge at the time. There was some controversy around what ultimately became NuGet, but you know, it's a package manager. It definitely deals with the thing. It's very, you know, they started out. It's like, how do we do Ruby gems for .NET? That became NuGet. Another side of the open source community, Signalr. So Damian Edwards and David Fowler were actually both Microsoft employees when they started this project in 2011, and they did it openly. Typically, your employment agreement at Microsoft, along with that whole you file patents around your writing code, it's like any code you write is Microsoft's. Now then, by 2011, that seemed absurd with the open source community starting to emerge and so forth. And so Damian and David said, hey, we have this idea for real-time communication on the web. We want to build an abstraction layer on it, and we're just going to do it in the open source community. Just telling you, we'll work on our own time, right? It's not part of our regular business and so forth. And it was accepted. It was agreed to. But they did it on GitHub from day one. So we're talking about a couple of Microsoft employees working at GitHub right off the bat and interacting with the community. And that information, that experience, they carried that back into the company. I mean, Damian and David are still there. And they interviewed them on .NET Rocks a number of times. I've interviewed them for the history of .NET as well. You know, it was very intentional to show you could make things and have an open source interaction. I mean, ultimately, Signalr did get brought into Microsoft as well and be included in the package, but stayed open source the whole way. So that to me is another interesting milestone, as much as jQuery was, hey, an external library that we've made contribution to and we include it with a product. Here is our own people building an open source project and we include it in the product. Let's tell the Roslyn story. Now, at the beginning of this idea of writing a compiler in a compiler, it's one of those in a language. It's one of those basic milestones of a mature language. You know your language is real when it can write its own compiler. And C# had always been written in C++. And there was always a pressure to make a C# implementation of the compiler, but it didn't happen. It's somewhat an academic exercise, and C# was wildly successful and had its own odd bugs and problems. And so it became more and more expensive to even consider the idea of writing C# and C#, and they didn't do it for many, many years. But 2011 is when they finally hit a tipping point where they realized they kind of needed to, and the issue was around Visual Studio. So in Visual Studio, you have IntelliSense and IntelliCode, and as you're typing code, it's essentially parsing it in real time and showing you its concerns, right? All the squiggly lines. Well, that compiler, that interpreter of your code, was separate from the actual C# compiler. So effectively, they were writing every C# feature twice, and heaven help you if they were ever different. And so ultimately, the pressure came and said, why are we duplicating this effort? We need a compiler as a service. So it can both be the compiler for the the app when it's being compiled and can act as this real-time compiler in Studio. That was ultimately how they got permission, or basically funding, to rewrite C# in C#. Now that's a huge job, and it was not planned to be necessarily an open source project per se. It was originally developed internally, and they did start publishing it on Codeplex. And around the time that this initiative really took off is when Anders Hallsberg, the father of C#, moved on. He didn't actually leave the company or anything. He actually turned a focus to a new problem, which turned out to be TypeScript. But he handed the reins for leading C# and the Roslyn initiative to Mats Torgensen. I'm going to breeze past Silverlight. We talked more about that in the previous talk. We only have so much time today, and it's not, none of that stuff was ever open source. But on the open source side and adjacent to this is our friend Miguel Diaz-Casa. Now 10 years further on at 39, forms a new company with his friend Nat Friedman called Xamarin. And they get serious about mobile development and C# for mobile development. So they're focused on iOS and Android and being able to code in C#. And for a startup company, it was very exciting times. Hard tools to build, and mobile development as a whole is challenging. But they were certainly all in on C#. I remember at that time in .NET Rock saying, I think the biggest believer in C# right now with Anders stepping away and Mads taking over, maybe Miguel de Icaza. Our friend Anders Hallsberg had success with TypeScript. So they were working on a static typing solution for JavaScript. I mean, that was the fundamentals of TypeScript. It became more, but they started it on Codeplex. And in October of 2012, the first early versions, the community test versions, were pushed to Codeplex, and people loved it. They got very excited about it, including big, somewhat anti-Microsoft organizations. The Palantir organization down in Southern California liked it so much that they wanted to be able to use TypeScript in Eclipse, the Java development environment. And so they actually made the plugin for Eclipse to code with JavaScript and contributed that into the open source libraries. Well, all of us out in the world now, if you were in the web world, TypeScript was pretty cool. It wasn't the only thing of its kind, right? There was the CoffeeScripts and so forth of the world. But internally to Microsoft, the success of TypeScript in the open source community and its relative disinterest for the regular Microsoft community was kind of a revelation. It was this proof point that Microsoft could make something in the open source world that open source people will like, irrespective of the company. Now, it didn't hurt that it was Anders, because people really like Anders, but mostly it was a great technology, and it was thoughtfully made, and it was made with community interaction, and it was successful. And it became one of the anchors internally to Microsoft to say, hey, we can succeed in the open source community when we do things the right way. And so fast forward another year, right in that same time frame, with Microsoft Open Technologies, MS Open as they call it. Jean-Paul Lee, who's very much from the open source community and the web community, ran it. And they externally, they focused on making sure that important open source libraries worked well with .NET. So things like Memcached and Elasticsearch and so forth, just making sure that the libraries, that if it was a cross-platform solution or a cross-stack solution, that there were good pieces for .NET in there as well. So Microsoft employees would actually move into MS Open Tech, and they would work for a while to improve those things out in the open source community. But internally, MS Open Tech was even more. There was a push towards certain libraries inside of Microsoft actually being open source. And one of the examples is Entity Framework. So Entity Framework was part of that early storm with alt.NET and so forth. Entity Framework had evolved a long way at this point. And but it had been built as a closed source product. It was covered in patents, like everything else that Microsoft had made for the most part up until then, with those notable exceptions, things like MVC and so forth. But there was a question basically postulated: is it possible to take an existing library that we don't charge for, right? It's just included with .NET, so it's totally revenue neutral, but could we make it an open source library? And so what they did, right, the challenge was to actually open source it, and that meant disentangling the patents from it. So you need to think about what this actually takes. They would sit down with the developers that had built these products like Entity Framework and go through them line by line, patent by patent, and decide were these patents valuable or not valuable? Could they be released? Just let them go? Could we be re-engineered and no longer conflict with the patents? Which is an interesting thought all by itself. It's like, you wrote this clever code, so clever we got a patent around it, and now we value that patent enough that we want to keep that patent, so we'll rewrite our code to not conflict with our own patent. Okay. But they did it. It took months and months and months of hard work to get to the bottom of, okay, we've rationalized all of the ownership of Entity Framework. And they did, as you know, open source Entity Framework. And again, more important internally to Microsoft than it was externally. That what it showed was you could go down the open source path with an existing set of libraries if you were willing to do the work to transform the licensing and ownership of that product into an open source product. And so that opened the door for even more possibilities. Now, what was interesting is that when that team succeeded, other teams inside of Microsoft went and said, how did you do it? And then actually saw what it took, when this is insane. And it helped improve the flow to make it easier to take libraries open source going forward. Now we get to the time that we're more comfortable with, where when Microsoft renames Azure from Windows Azure to Microsoft Azure. So we're in that 2013, 2014 timeframe, which is after the big push of Windows 8, and it doesn't go particularly well. And the .NET community is one of the highlights of Windows 8, even if it wasn't the focus. And the shift away from Windows is fully underway. And so we get back to that moment with Satya Nadella now as CEO as of February of 2014, and the change of Azure. And so at the Build event in the spring of 2014, right as I started this conversation, Satya's the CEO. They're giving away Windows for free now on devices under 9-inch screens. And they release Roslyn, which had originally been an internal project and was never talked about being cross-platform, but with the re-engineering and the new focus, they push it over to GitHub rather than Codeplex, and they commit to being cross-platform as well as open source. That was a good day for Anders. He got to deploy Roslyn to GitHub, but then also TypeScript 1 releases as well, also on GitHub. And they create the .NET Foundation. So they begin the same thing that the Apache Foundation and other open source groups have done to say, how do we protect important software living in the open source world from inappropriate use and potential lawsuits? And that's really what the foundation is about. Miguel Diaz was on that stage, and he put pieces of Xamarin into the .NET Foundation, and maybe other folks on this call actually that have their stuff in the .NET Foundation today. But this story gets easy now. Like, we've kind of gone through the hard parts. Now it became this conversation about, if we're going forward from here and taking open source seriously, starting to really build stuff on GitHub as we've learned how, what are we going to do about .NET? And so part of that announcement in that same year wasn't actually at Build, but later on they said, we're going to rewrite .NET. They had looked at the existing .NET code base, which at this point is 15 plus years old, and said, like, is it possible to do what we did with Entity Framework? It was just like, it's not feasible. And it's too tightly bound to Windows anyway. It's not enough to just be open source, but to be open source and cross-platform. And so it actually made more sense, less effort ultimately, to re-engineer the .NET to .NET as a cross-platform open source library. It's not that it was easy. It still took them 18 months. But also that first year and a half was them learning how to live on GitHub, to actually do their design meetings out in public, to take feedback, and ultimately to take contributions into the framework. Not that it's easy to contribute to the .NET Core. Like, I don't recommend it. That's some pretty serious coding you're talking about here, and a very mature set of libraries. So the .NET Core 1 first releases in June of 2016 with an MIT license, so very permissive. And then 1.1 is the version that gets bundled with Studio 2017. And now 2.1, we get into this new support model where they have a long-term support, which is 3 years, and a short-term support, which is 3 months after the next version comes out. And rapidly iterating all the way till today, till November of 2020 with .NET 5. There is no .NET 4 because numbers are hard. Don't want to confuse anyone. But .NET 5 is now, they have the problem of, we have our standard framework, which largely has stayed still, has not had a huge number of features, been well maintained, but not a lot of new features going into that. We are also now seeing features as of 3 and 3.1 that were going into .NET Core that weren't showing up in the framework. And so 5, they're trying to bring all the pieces together. And that's separating out this cross-platform open source piece from more Windows-specific pieces like WinForms and WPF and so on. And I would be remiss not to talk about Visual Studio Code. It has been another wild success for Microsoft, building an editor and what they know about editors, designed not just for the .NET community or for the Microsoft dev community. I've been caught by Home Assistant, and if you know what that is, you know what I mean by caught by it. It's a home automation tool. It can run on Raspberry Pi, it can run in a VM, it can run in Docker. But they are now recommending when you got to edit your YAML for Home Assistant, Visual Studio Code integrated right into it. It's fantastic. By 2016, Xamarin did join Microsoft. It made sense, ultimately. They did get acquired, which brought these two remarkable individuals into the organization. I mean, Miguel Diaz is one of the finest leaders of software developers I've ever met, and has built some extraordinary things. Nat Friedman, also vitally important to the organization, and you realize today now he is the CEO of GitHub as the wholly owned subsidiary. But the open source world is also still evolving, and I would be remiss if I didn't talk about Kubernetes, because as the container architecture expanded so dramatically, coming out of the Linux community, you know, they found a lightweight way to do virtualization that abstracted the operating system, that got us into this model that was very practical of servers that were cattle rather than pets, that it was easier when you did an update to just build a whole new infrastructure and push it out to the cloud or onto your virtualized servers. And there were many different orchestration engines. I mean, there really still are, but somehow Kubernetes is one. And why is that? You know, this is, to me, this also feels like the VHS beta argument of the different video formats. It doesn't necessarily have to be the best. You know, one could argue whether Kubernetes is actually the best, but it's the one that people rally behind for a bunch of reasons. Kubernetes came out of Google Cloud, and it was Brendan Burns leading that project at the time. Microsoft had their own implementation, their own technology and Service Fabric. Amazon had Elastic Cloud, right? Each one was unique to the individual major cloud vendor, and yet they all ended up implementing Kubernetes. I mean, one of the things that happened was that Brendan came over to Microsoft in July of 2016. And that's an interesting play, to have a leader of an important library like that come change companies. And of course, the moment that Microsoft was implementing Kubernetes, that pretty much meant that Amazon had to. And at that point, now you have a common solution across all these platforms. It built out an ecosystem, and it's not, now you had the ecosystem of Kubernetes libraries, things like Helm and other tools that really expanded it. So effectively, Kubernetes wins. This ecosystem grows around it. You have you tip a tipping point of the number of developers who understand it, where now it's a hireable role. It's not unique. The question is it good for us? Is this a healthy monopoly? If Kubernetes dominates the orchestration, container orchestration engine, are we better off? You know, the power of that ecosystem, of all that tooling and resources and skilled people and available on all the platforms, it's kind of a natural monopoly, but not that anyone controls it completely either, that you have choices around it. So we have this new model using open source that can give us those natural monopolies, but not actually be too badly locked in. By 2017, Microsoft didn't shut down Codeplex. They turned it into an archive. All advancing code moved over to GitHub. And then in 2018, they actually acquired GitHub. It went remarkably well, the acquisition of GitHub, in the sense that while there was some complaints from the broader open source community, there was also a lot of people in the open source community that said, hey, GitHub's safe now. They don't need to make money. They're not going to be preyed on or shut down. Microsoft has bet their own development stacks on it, so it's in a safe place. Now, they've kept it as a wholly owned subsidiary, and that's great. Well, hopefully that'll, presumably that'll stay that way. You know, so far so good. It's 2+ years on, but I'm optimistic that it's landed well. And we've seen sessions around GitHub Actions and so forth, like the integration of the Microsoft dev stack into GitHub continues. Also in 2018, Microsoft took 60,000 of its own patents and pressed it over to the Open Invention Network. So it's certainly not all of Microsoft patents. Microsoft has hundreds of thousands of patents, but they nothing to do with Windows or Azure within there. And that development model, that patented development model, is still going on inside of Microsoft for things like Azure, without a doubt. But the reason to push those patents over there was, again, to sort of move past this cross-licensing model into this. If you are building code, there's a group here that holds all of these patents to protect against patent trolls, against being attacked for licensing. Microsoft had made a significant commitment to Linux at that point with Azure Sphere. And, you know, if you go onto the Microsoft store, you actually find there's a half a dozen different flavors of Linux you can download, as well as run them on Azure. And so part of their movements for the OIN was actually to protect Linux. And I'd be remiss not to talk about Azure Sphere, because it's interesting to me that Microsoft makes their own version of Linux. You know, that was a good day in that sense. You know, that there's recognition that the operating system isn't the pivotal part of the company. It's more the cloud and the ability to make everything work across all of that. So that evolution has also happened in .NET Core, where we're now taking platform-specific libraries like WinForms and implementing them separately so that they can work cross-platform. It'd be interesting to see if we see UI implementations on other platforms. I believe Sam was talking a bit about Maui, which seems to be headed down that path, but with miles to go. And, you know, thinking about the old Edge browser that pretty much nobody used versus Chrome, and so now ultimately we have the new Edge browser that uses the same rendering engine. So Microsoft and Google were already working closely together in building their browsers back in those days. They worked on the W3C. They would test out different implementations and standards. They would agree to move forward. So the idea that they eventually just reuse the Chromium engine kind of makes sense. It'll be interesting to see how that pans out from a compete perspective. You know, Google gives away that browser because they like the digital exhaust that comes from it to help understand how to market to people. Microsoft's not necessarily in that business, so maybe the things are going to go differently, but we haven't actually seen any of that. And we talked a bit about .NET 5 and this consolidation. Also, the next set of cuts, for example, WCF not moving to .NET 5. There are some open source efforts out there. I'm thinking about things like Recode that are helping to convert WCF over to more modern approaches to communication, like gRPC. So, and a lot of that's being done with open source libraries as well. Microsoft did make an attempt to see if they could make an open source version of WCF, hit a certain point and went, yeah, this doesn't make sense. It's going to be too difficult. But they at least took their efforts and put it out into the open source community to say, if you want to continue, go ahead, but we're going to work on other things. There are better ways going forward. So, you know, folks committed to WCF are a little concerned, but it doesn't stop them from using WCF. It's just the question of where that's actually going to go forward, or do you want to re-engineer? I think we're a long way away from being done here in terms of what's coming next. If you've been listening to .NET Rocks this past year, you've seen me do a number of shows around how the open source community is living with the tech giants, the Googles, and the Microsofts and so forth. I worry that they use being open source as cover for still somewhat destructive practices. You know, how often do they just build something new rather than utilize something that already exists in the community? But as long as it's wrapped in an open source banner, it's okay. I certainly am concerned about that, and it's interesting to have those conversations and see where folks are. We did a couple of shows where we were talking about, hey, as long as you were way down the long tail, your open source project was great, but as soon as it got to a certain size, you may suddenly have a bunch of full-time contributors from these companies that pay them because they want to help direct that product to where their customers are. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? I think it's very challenging and interesting to talk about. But Microsoft is deeply immersed in the open source community now, as are most tech giants. And we just got to try and figure out who the kinder, friendlier tech giant is in all this and what the right way is going forward. The open source community itself is changing, without a doubt. I've never been as much a member of it then as I am now. You know, I come from enterprise development too, but I've been moved, and I care about how this works going forward and trying to help tell a story of, you know, what the modern open source world looks like. I hope this was useful to you. It's certainly been a lot of fun for me. Happy to stick around and answer questions for as long as you want. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Richard. I'm going to stop the recording now, and if anybody has any questions,